Hello and welcome to JavaScript Marathon, a full day of free online courses in some of the leading web development technologies and concepts. I'm Sarah Renaud with this.labs, and I have been your marathon host. Our last and final, but not least, session is with Morgan Worrell, Senior Software Engineer at this.labs. Welcome, Morgan, to JavaScript Marathon.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for having me.
Morgan will be presenting Advanced Ngrx, building a reusable feature store. He can be found on Twitter at Morganism_, and I will drop that in the chat for everyone. Special thanks to our sponsor, this.labs. This.labs offers personalized training programs to suit your organizational needs, ensuring you and your company stay on the leading edge. If you find keeping up with constantly evolving technologies a struggle and want to bring your team up to speed on one of the latest technologies, contact us today at hi@this.co to set up your complimentary needs assessment. We have a ton of upcoming events. First and foremost, State of U is tomorrow with Evan Yu and a ton of other contributors. It starts at 9 a.m. Pacific time. State of Accessibility is next Tuesday, May 25th. We have an amazing accessibility panel. Getting started with GraphQL, that is an intro training with Moon Highway on June 1st. And then State of Angular Ecosystem is June 3rd with the Angular core team. And then finally, we are back July for a special edition of JavaScript Marathon. We're doing it for a week. So we're going to have one session per day starting July 19th. We're going to drop those details soon, so stay tuned at javascriptmarathon.com or follow us at this.media on Twitter. And with that, I'm going to hand the keys over to Morgan.
All right. Hi again, everyone. Thanks, Sarah, for the awesome intro. Today, we'll be talking about advanced Ngrx concepts, specifically how we can build a reusable feature store. I'm very excited about this topic because I'm very passionate about Ngrx and state management. So I think we would have a very great conversation today. So before we jump into anything technical, any practical code pieces, we want to go through and briefly talk about our Ngrx best practices. The whole point of the reason why we use Ngrx is so that we can gain more control over our application. We can then listen in on events to see what's going on, kind of separate concerns from what we want to happen in our Angular components, and Ngrx is used in Angular, and focus on separating the component result from whatever is happening in our data store and how we serve that data to our front-end components. A couple of concerns, though, that we want to keep focus as we develop an Ngrx paradigm is our three main concerns of developing for clarity, so make things clear, developing to keep things concise, so making sure that we have the same patterns, the same flow, the same kind of paradigm from start to finish, utilizing best practices, and that we're very intentional about what it is that we're trying to develop. Can another developer come into the project? Can they see exactly what is going on with the project and how we've built it out? And what's going on in Ngrx, especially for those who may be new to Ngrx. If we have any persons that are new, feel free to chime in with questions. We will be going over some pretty advanced stuff. So keep in mind that you do need to have a little bit of Ngrx background to understand what's going on, but I'll do my best to break down the steps as we go through those. So the problem that we're trying to address today is that we have a feature store that has a number of different similar features that present a kind of a code smell. We want to go from a current state to a future state in our code development and bring things into the 3 points that we mentioned earlier, being clear, concise, and intentional. So what happens when we develop a store that ends up having so much boilerplate and so much overhead for features that have a lot of similar functionality is that they become overly complex, meaning that we can tend to write a lot of extra code to try to handle the main points of being um, indirect with our component and our store interaction. We try to put in too many intermediate layers. Maybe we may try to use facades, where facades have this very indirect layer between our component and our store. So the component doesn't have any knowledge of the store. Maybe we try to over engineer something and try to make it go through extra hoops just to realize a very specific need. In our case, we'll be looking at how we manage different photo assets as a prelude to some of the code that we'll be going into. And so that can tend to be managing photo assets in and of itself can tend to be a complex paradigm and over engineered. And the last thing about having too much repeated code, too much boilerplate code, is that it can become hard to decipher. All of these three things play so heavily together and are tightly coupled. And so we want to take essentially this ball of yarn and begin to tug at one string and tug at another piece and tug at another piece until we've unwound this ball of yarn to where it makes more sense. The next problem that we tend to face is inconsistent patterns with Ngrx when we're developing. These inconsistent patterns can come about by rushing to meet a deadline, which is a huge factor when it comes to developing for business needs. We're trying to meet a deadline, we're trying to race to the finish line, we're trying to meet the sprint commitment, and we put in a kind of a monkey patch solution instead of doing it the right way, making sure that we have good action hygiene, and then carrying that good action hygiene down into our effects, making sure that we don't abuse our effects, and then carrying that through to our selectors. We have too many hands in the code sometimes. Maybe we might have a mix of mid, senior, and new hires touching the code. And oftentimes, new hires and mid-level developers are still coming up to scratch, so to speak, with how to use Ngrx the right way, how to keep proper hygiene, and how to call actions the right way, and when to call certain effects. Sometimes, though, having too many hands in the kitchen, or too many cooks in the kitchen, as some people like to say, presents more of technical debt in the long run. So a lot more cleanup has to happen because there haven't been best practices defined before. Maybe they haven't been communicated. Maybe training was poor, or a lack of unit testing, which is very vital to the health and hygiene of an application. And I touched on the point of novice hands, but this is especially important because we want to make sure that we go into our application and into our team, helping lift up the rest of our team to the same standard that a mid-level or senior level on architect would put into their code development. We want to make sure that we instill the right practices and the right training in our teammates so that they can level up. And then whenever they have new hires, they can help level them up as well. Our final problem that we tend to face with Ngrx and poor state management, is that with a lot of the boilerplate that comes with Ngrx, with a lot of the setup, a lot of the files that we need to manage everything, there tends to be this expensive maintenance cost to keep everything up to date and working as it should. Especially when there's a lack of unit testing, or even if there is a lot of unit testing, the amount of boilerplate that is required sometimes turns people off from using Ngrx. And what we want to do here is address the pain points that we will face and move to a better state, to be more concise, to be clearer, and to be more intentional with our code. So then we can resolve these kinds of costs, minimize our technical debt, and move on to a better state. So what are the outcomes of this training? What do we want to learn from trying to build a reusable feature store? Some of our main objectives: we want to try to minimize as much duplication as possible. When the whole term of reusability comes up, we think of how we can boil something down into an atomic component, so to speak, something that's not coupled to anything else. So it encompasses the concept of coupling and decoupling. When something is coupled is when we have a feature or service, a function that has usually a one-way data flow and it is aware of where it's being used. But instead, we want to be decoupled. We want a service or a feature or a function to not necessarily be aware of what is going on around it, but it's still useful and able to be used by the various points within an application or feature that need it. So we want to minimize that duplication. Um, the next objective that we want to go about with this approach is identifying some of the caveats as well as the benefits of implementing this particular pattern and why and when it could be useful and when we shouldn't use it. Lastly, we want to emphasize the three tenets. They're probably not the official three tenets, but we do want to keep them as in the back of our mind when it comes to development. That we always want to be we want to be clear. The code is readable. We want to be consistent. We're using the same pattern throughout the entirety of the application, same code hygiene, etc., and that we are very intentional with our code and we know exactly what it's going to do. And we can handle all of this and accomplish this by means of consolidation. Consolidation, merging, reducing duplicate code, all of those are synonyms for the same concept that we're going to tackle today. So why should we even consider consolidation, especially in this context where we're talking about a feature store? Why even consider handling a consolidation level of effort? Well, if we take a step back, we disregard the data store for a second, and we look at the business as a whole. Most oftentimes, the business ends up growing in scale, in depth and in width, taking on more clients or web portals or merging with other companies. And in the case of my experience, um, in a previous opportunity that I was a part of, we acquired 3 or 4 different portals by merging smaller companies into our other startup company that just made this website experience even more explosive, but it raised the need for consolidating those like experiences and distilling them down into a very similar and common experience that if you had existing customers coming into the application, they knew exactly what they were doing. They didn't have to guess about it. Their authentication identity was the same. Their functionality and features were the same. They knew exactly where to find things and without any headache. For new customers that may not be aware with another company's experience, we want to make sure that they also are directed into the right path and we keep that same level of consistency across the board. So the whole concept of this consolidation piece is, again, that keyword consistency. We want to bring a level of consistency to our customers. The same thing is true when we boil it down to the data store. We want to keep that level of consistency on the team with our developers, that when a developer, new hire, or a person who hasn't touched a feature in months and is coming back to it, looks at the code and they know exactly what's going on. There's no need to do more red-green refactoring, which tends to be the largest effort of consolidation work, is taking two things and or two or more things and trying to mash them together to make them work, and try to minimize as much of the maintenance costs that we have across those efforts. The third thing that we want to address is how we can better manage our defects through consolidation, how we can minimize our technical debt and make things easier for us to continue to iterate on, because this whole idea of consolidation is really for the benefit of the business in its entirety. We do all of this work on the background so that our customer and the business can benefit, and on the foreground. So when should we consider doing any consolidation? And hi, Eric. You're not too late. Welcome. We're just getting into talking about how we can utilize this reusable store and touching on some points on consolidation. When we consolidate, excuse me, there are a couple of things that we want to consider. Consolidation is a hard to answer question of when exactly to do it. Excuse me. It really is based on the business's objectives. We need to first make sure that the business isn't going to suffer, or our customers are not going to suffer because we decided to start this initiative and we don't know where the start or the end goal is. We may even have a clear picture about where it is, where we want to start with it, but not having awareness of what the rest of the business or organization wants to achieve often puts us in this siloed space where we're cut off from the needs of the business and we're not fulfilling um, what we need to as developers for our contract with the business. The other thing that we want to address when to consider consolidation is when we're not interfering with other development work. Can we continue to progress in our development efforts without hindering other developers on the team, slowing down other feature work, again, hindering the business? Um, but in this particular context, we don't want to make things more um, complicated. We want to keep things clear and concise. We want to be able to look at something and say, you know, exactly what's going on, and it's obvious. And when we determine that we need to do consolidation, one of the very first things that you do with anything is coming up with a great plan. You need to have a roadmap in place. And that roadmap has to be aligned with the business goal as well, because you can't handle technical debt or feature working commitment without knowing what the business needs. And you can't come up with a decent roadmap if you don't know what the application's doing. So that could involve performing an audit of your application, going through your components, making sure that your presentational components are presentational, making sure your smart components are smart, based on Ngrx concepts and atomic design. And also thinking about how we can take the current state of things. If things aren't working or presented the way that they're supposed to, how can we then move on to the next state? That is one of the architectural concepts that you learn as a software engineer, the moving from a current state to future state and asking yourself the questions, how do we get there? What tools we can use to get there or best achieve that goal? What benefits will we gain as a result of building out this roadmap, taking this effort, spending the resources of time and money, um, and even scope, the golden triangle, um, and how we can try to consolidate that down into um, something that's manageable. How can we then execute on that and make it meaningful for the business? So with that, I don't see any questions in the chat, so I'm going to move straight on to the practical part of things. Now that we've gone through some of the main concepts of what it means to consolidate and keeping in line with our core NGRX principles. Again, for those of you that just joined, those core principles are making things clear, making things concise, and making things intentional. That clarity, when I go to the code, I can tell what's going on. The being concise, we're using the same patterns consistently throughout the application, and being intentional, we're programming for an intended purpose. We're programming for a purpose. We know exactly what's going on. So jumping over to the practical side, I do have a repo for those of you following along. That should have been shared out. So you can go ahead and follow along with me. I won't be doing exactly a live coding example, but I will show you two different approaches to how we can tackle the problem that we're addressing today with consolidation with an asset or photo library, a photo gallery. So if you're looking at the application and you have it spun up, I would recommend you start off with the unconsolidated branch first. So I have a couple of branches in here. Disregard master. Unconsolidated is the starting point, which we'll be breaking down this code. And here is the application. It is using, just to give you some assumptions about the application and what's going on with it right now, we're using Unsplash as the API backend for this. And Unsplash has a number of different photo types that you can pull up photos for. And I'm going to go ahead and run this so that we make sure we have this going. With this photo library, there's not a whole lot going on with it. It's using some Tailwind on the front end to keep the sorting of the grid layout. Very basic components here. There's no routing. This is just using a very basic click action for routes. I'm going to open up the dev tools here so that we can see what's going on. And once the application is finished compiling, we should be able to refresh. And there we go. So we initially start off with people. People is our default category here. And we can continue to migrate through this or navigate through this application by clicking on the different assets and seeing those different assets load up. Now, because this is tapped into Unsplash's API, we will get updates in the images. So don't be too alarmed by that. Another thing to note too, that if you're going to pull down this repo, I do recommend that you go over to Unsplash and register for a developer account. You will need an access key, which I don't provide my personal access key for Unsplash, unfortunately. Sorry, everyone. But go ahead and get your own access key, stick that in a .end file, and I can actually show that on my side. So I have a .end file right here. I'm going to not click on it because I don't want to expose my access key, but we want to make sure that we have an access key that is represented in this way. So here's where that data is going to be fed into. It's using .env to feed in our environment variables. So the base API URL you'll need to include as well as the access key. And you can go ahead and rename this to whatever you want, but making sure that you have that .env file will be helpful to running this entire application. And we are using the Redux dev store as well, so that would be helpful in watching our actions and seeing updates in the store. Other things about the application that we have going on, it's really a bare bones kind of an app. In this unconsolidated branch, the problem that we're facing is that we have this photo gallery that is, it's functional. It does what we want it to do, but it's not performant. Yes, it's clear. You can go into the store, which I do have a store here for all of the different slices of the state, loading up those photo assets, and we can go into wallpapers, for example, look at the actions that's going on. We have our load, success, and fail. We have effects that define what happens when we decide to load an action, and storing the actions in success. What happens in the reducer? So a very, very bare bones and basic kind of a reducer state here. We're using entities to manage each of the photos. And at the very end of this presentation, I'll show you how you can, in the consolidated version of this code, utilize the entity adapter with our reusable store. And of course, we have our selectors to help select our slices of state. But the problem with this particular application is that if I go into my architecture store and I look at my actions, you can see some similarities here. There's a lot of similar things going on than when I looked at wallpapers. I can actually open up actions here. I can open up wallpaper actions, do a little split screen thing here, and notice that they have a very similar shape. Like when we talk about the shape of an application or the shape of an object or the shape of a DTO, a data transfer object, how we establish like a contract between the front end and the back end. All of these things have a very specific shape about them. And when you're thinking about the concept of reusability and how we can consolidate things and bring things into a more distilled singular use that's reusable, um, the concept of abstraction comes up. This whole thing of consolidation is just another synonym for abstraction. It's the computer science term for abstraction. And so what we could do is abstract how we reference these actions, how we reference the effects and other portions of the reducer and the selector. Why would we want to do that kind of a thing? What are the drawbacks from doing that, especially in Ngrx? Well, right now we won't have any drawbacks because we have very similar shapes across all of the different feature stores here. And I'll even point out here some of these services that I had to create in order to get this thing to work, which if you're following along, I do not recommend this approach. This is just what I needed to do to get to this point in the application. But having all of these different service files that have similar shape, I have to say right away, do not design your application in this way. Um, this is another example of a very bad, this is very smelly. A very bad code smell. All of these things need to be consolidated. All of our store elements need to be consolidated. We're faced with a problem of too much repeated code. We have a lot of boilerplate, and we need to minimize our code and make it more performant and more efficient. First, let me show you though what's going on in the store. For those of you that aren't familiar with Ngrx, this will be helpful so you see exactly what's going on in the store and why it is we're even having this conversation. So in the store, using our Redux dev tools, I'm going to go through a refresh here so we get a fresh version of the store. And then we can see that we load up some topics. The topics are what's where we're getting these categories from that we can click on, these different buttons at the top. Once we've loaded up our topics, so we call our initial action, nothing in the state is going to change. So our state tree is going to look like the default. Our diff is very empty. When we get success, we've loaded in some entities, we've loaded in topics. We have IDs and entities because we're using an entity adapter. We can see from the action, from the success, that we got the topics that we wanted. Now I could have fleshed this out with even more topics, but I decided to limit it to 5, and 5 are the most common ones. Once we have the topics, we use the topics to then fetch the photos. This is an approach that I am stating now, like, do not use unless you really, really need to, or really have some hacky way to make your assets or CRUD perform the way that you want to fetch and do updates. But only because the topics provides the link to a very specific set of topics photos that I'm using this particular pattern. But once we have our people loaded up, our Redux dev store is going to store those people, and we can see that we're limiting it to 9 entries. And as we have loaded up people here, we can then look at our state, and we see that in our state, we have one state tree populated with people. If I switch over to nature, nature now has one state tree updated. People is still persisting its data. It's still hydrated, the concept in Ngrx for making sure that the data store is filled with information. It's already hydrated now. Go over to architecture. Architecture is hydrated. So now we see more and more things that are becoming hydrated and persisting across the board. performance-wise, this can be a potentially good thing. If I were to come back to people, in our case, in our example, people is still hydrated with the same data. So we're not making another network call to hydrate people. And if we were talking about pagination, or we wanted to even address the concept of pagination in this entire app, we would obviously want to account for more than just 9 things, and we would want to implement a virtual scroll. But for the basis of this particular application, we're not going to address those things. We're just going to focus on 9 entries per category. So how do we want to make the store shape look better? Right now it's good, and we could run with this. But what if we wanted to turn our photo gallery into something editable? We want to perform more CRUD services against it, and we want to set up our application to that means. We want to go from the current state of just viewing assets to potentially being able to edit our assets. Well, this is going to be a nightmare to try to maintain and add in more actions and perform the same functions, simply because all of the different fetch services and store pieces that we have are overly complicated. They're seemingly simple, but it's too much reused code. We're calling things over and over, and keeping so much in the store, um, that we have this bloated code base of extra boilerplate that we can consolidate and make abstracted. So switching back over to the code again. So we can begin to kind of perform some cleanup on this by, um, as an example, we can make a photos service.ts, right? Generate a service, call this photo service, and then do some magic where we take this, the same kind of paradigm, and maybe these values will change as we decide to do pagination if we want. Because I already have the interface for a photo defined for an abstracted version of the same thing, of the same model that I want to keep throughout the application, I'm just going to go ahead and pull that in. And I do want to return a URL. In this case, this URL could be a dynamic URL. We could pull it from the link that we get here, from whatever photos URL we pass in, and do this sort of thing. Or we can even listen in on the environment variable, since we already have that as part of the process end that we discussed earlier. So we have either we provided this, or we just fall back to the default. And then we can continue to get our photos from this. And just like that, we've consolidated our service. It's one of the things that we need to do to help realize getting our NGRX store consolidated and boiled down to a single instance. So taking that one thing into account, now we can begin to use this in an effect. And as I said, I'm going to just open up the consolidated branch and walk through some of that code, so we don't have to live code too much. But before I switch over, notice how in our store here, in this barrel file, this index.ts, the store is referencing all of these effects, all of these reducers, all of these different slices of state, importing and exporting all of those different pieces, so that the rest of the application knows that it exists. When we switch over to the consolidated branch. I'll have to stash my changes really quickly. Go to the consolidated branch. Notice how much smaller that entire file is. Eric, this is exactly what one of my projects is suffering. I have a few stories with repeated CRUDs that now it's too hard to maintain all of them. Yep, definitely, definitely. Um, and I'll show you a nice little trick that you can do to help even maintain being able to use entity adapters, even with consolidating things down, because we'd be able to still access the adapter methods and maintain those entity states. So digging into some of the store code here, right? Notice that now all of our different photo types are just now photos. Like, yes, they're separated by topics, yes, they're separated by category. And this is a real world scenario where there's an application that has multiple services, multiple stores set up in such a way and doing this overly complicated, over engineered store setup. And it actually has a lot of duplication because things are so tightly named in their actions, their effects, their reducers, and everything that it makes it hard to reuse a specific thing. You have to then come up with this data bus, so to speak. You have to come up with this mapper of like passing in an asset and then having it do a switch case to launch a specific action and then return that data back, return a specific selector for that specific store. But if you notice now, if we go into this new store, starting from the data from the photo services piece, photo service does exactly what I was doing before I stashed my changes in the unconsolidated branch. I have this new get photos piece. I am dynamically setting a URL. It could be based on the topic's URL. It could be based on the base URL. The the topic's photo URL is a quick correction. The topic's photo URL comes from the topic, and I still had to do kind of a little bit of a hacky way of fetching the photos by the topic. There's a totally cleaner way to do this, but for the purposes of this example, this is what I use to grab the specific topic's photos. But it's all in one service. That's consolidation step number one. Number two, photos is now just one data store. And I can continue to utilize this one data store because I have the magic power of selectors. Before I get into the selectors piece though, let's look at our actions. We're going to go from the top down within this file structure and look exactly what's going on. So we got a load photo. Now things are photo. It's very generic. Photo success takes photos, takes an array of photo types. Failed is straightforward, but we have this new action in here for setting the active photo type. This is the thing that's going to help us in our new store setup. It's going to help us with how we load and select the right slice of store state. Jumping down to our reducer next. The reducer is where all this magic is going to happen. So first of all, I define my photo state. But what's going on here with this next piece? This photo type state. I'm using an index property to map my photo state for every slice of an asset that I need. And I specifically named it photo type instead of naming it X because I want it to be concise and clear for whoever's going to be digging into this code. This will tell us right off the bat that we're going to expect a state store that's going to have an addressable set of deeper nested states that we can access by using a string method. The way that we then build that up is going to look similar to this. If you look in the comment here, we'll then end up having something similar to people, nature, architecture, wallpapers, etc., going forward with this particular state setup. And this is what this reducer, this reduce function is doing here, setting up those initial states. All these initial states is what's building up this photo type state. Here's the tricky part though with this particular setup. Because TypeScript is a little bit finicky about types when it comes to intersects, which this is a type intersect, we have to define it this way as an intersect instead of taking this property and trying to stick it in the original type state. Disregard this being angry, focus on this being angry. We're defining an index type here. That's a very generic type. And then trying to define something very specific right next to it. TypeScript is not like that. So the only way to make that work simply and safely is by attaching that extra typed piece onto the state that we want. This allows us to maintain an indexed type as well as a very specific type side by side. And now this becomes our photos state. So in our photos state, and I left a number of helpful comments here to help you understand the different caveats behind this, but I'll go through and explain it. Within this photo state, we can set up the overarching initial photo state, which has the reduced object of initial states nested inside. Those initial pieces are all the different topics of photos. And the reason why this is so useful is because it's indexed, so I can continue to add more topic types, especially in an application where I've allowed users to log in and create more topic types and upload topics based on a collection. I can continue to use this as the means to access specifically the collection that I want of a single store. And I don't have to introduce a whole lot of boilerplate to do that. You'll notice here in line 47, though, that I have this specific property typed as an any. And I could have initially resolved this to a null, and that would have worked just fine. However, because when I launched the application, and this is really depending on your choice and how you want to do this, when I first launched the application, I want to see people loaded first. So people is going to be the slice of state that I want to select. That's important in this particular setup because right now, if I left it as null, the application will have no idea what to pick unless you have a load resolver for your routing module set up to then load the specific piece that you want. In my case, because I'm not using routing, I'm using a hacky way, which honestly, I wouldn't recommend doing that either. I'm just going to automatically set it to select the slice of state that I want. The reason why I have a type as any, though, is because, again, of the same concept of sandwiching a specific property type with an index property type or a set of index property types, that TypeScript doesn't like it. So we need to coerce our specific property types into an any state, which it's not the best approach, having to force type things into an any state. But because the code is so concise and everything lives in one place, you can always come back to the definition of or the shape of the object of how you know the state of the store is going to be, and you always know exactly what you need to pass in for the particular piece. So moving on to the reducer. The way then that we can access those specific slice of state is by referencing the selected photo type. The selected photo type can be indexed to then grab us that slice of state that we're looking for. And then we have an action that references updating slice of that photo type. And again, because photo type is also is a specific property type, I do have to type the return or the new value that I'm trying to set it to as any, or else TypeScript will yell. With a little bit of that typing headache kind of out of the way, though, we get a lot more powerhouse out of this reusable reducer. Like, this is the main reusable part of the entire store is in this reducer. Um, we can add more actions in here if we need to. If, let's say, for example's sake, that I go into actions and I want to do something very specific to one topic type, I can come in here and create a new action, and I call it, maybe I want something to do with wallpapers. I want to modify wallpapers. So user updated wallpapers. We don't know how they updated the wallpapers. They could have deleted it. They could have rotated it. They could have cropped it. Who knows what they did to that particular thing? All that we know is that we want to pass the action, the wallpaper back in and update the store. So let's say user rotated wallpaper. And this is a very, very specific case for our photo store. So we have this setup going on. These are updated wallpapers. And we can even put some helpful comments in here. Say, these are wallpaper actions. I say wallpapers because it's how the topic is defined in Unsplash. And I take that action and I go into the reducer and I do this number and I say do the update at the wallpaper. I take my wallpaper and I want to edit a very specific slice of my state here where this wallpaper, I probably wanted to do like some entity adapter here, but for pseudocode sake, let's say that I did, photos that I have to get the, let's continue with a pseudocoded example here. This is assuming that we've grabbed the right slice of state. We actually would have done this and got photos, but there's a cleaner way we could write this. And then we say we want to filter, and then we want to take, where it's wallpaper, and then do whatever modifications, to that particular thing, and then update that one particular slice where we took the whole slice of the photos here and then re-updated the rehydrated the photo state for that particular slice, right? So the selected type is already assigned for us because we're on the front end, we're on that particular screen. We already have the wallpapers being fed as the selected type. And now we can go in here and do a very specific action for wallpaper and then look at wallpaper and do whatever updates to wallpaper. And this would be much easier to update if we use an entity adapter, which I'll show you here in a little bit. But we can continue to do things like that if we need to for very specific actions. If I want specifically wallpapers, if I wanted to do something for people, I can do a similar thing. But it's all based on when this action gets called and when we're using the very specific selected photo type. The way that we can then access that slice of the state in the selector here is by doing just one extra step to drill down into the specific state that we want. So here we select the active photo type, and then we take the active photo type and then take the overall state of the photo state, and then just return the photo type. Heck, you could even do this all in one step if you really wanted to, and say, state pass array like that. And now we've got the selected state. But for the sake of brevity and readability and potential reuse of this particular slice, I like to have these broken out in this particular fashion. So let's see how this then operates. I'm going to undo the changes that I did here. So we're back at a running state again with our app. I'm going to spin this up and we can see what's going on in the store. Share this again. Give this a second and it'll update for us. Cool. Now we refresh the page. Nothing's really different. The look and feel of things, pretty standard. Our network is the same. We didn't really look at network before, but finding my Redux Dev Tools. Man, sometimes that's a task. I'm still doing the kind of hodgepodgey way of loading my photos by using the topics and then feeding that photo in. I can kind of show you the reason why that happens is because when you load up topics and you go into Unsplash's API, they have the links to the different topic types. So you can get it as an HTML link, the link to the actual photos itself, so topics/wallpapers, which you could just like take this, and append the topic so you can get the dynamic switching between topics if you want, and a link to self. I'm not exactly sure what self would be used for unless I was clicking an asset and opening it in a new tab. But I'm using this photos piece here. That's the part that's loading up my images for me. It's the only reason why I'm using load topics. But the result is that when I load up my photos, I get photos. But let's look at the state. Photo state, nothing else is hydrated. Yet I have one chunk for my entire state tree. I get people. People has its photos. Everything's loaded up. If I switch over to nature, nature works. I just reset the active asset type. So you can see that the selected photo type went from people to nature. And now nature success, new photos are populated in nature. And now I've got nature photos. Do the same thing with fashion. Look at these lovely people dressed really well. Selected photo type is now fashion. And if I minimize these other state trees, I have fashion. So this is very, very powerful. It's some of the caveats, though, that we need to be aware of with this approach, though, is that it is not a one-size-fits-all thing. It's very helpful to use this kind of a thing, this kind of a pattern, when you are dealing with similar feature assets, which is the reason why the topic is what it is. We want to create a reusable feature store for a particular kind of feature. You wouldn't want to create this kind of thing if your feature types, the handshake between your front end and the back end code, those shapes aren't the same. You wouldn't want to mash those down into a similar store. Now, you could try to do that, but you would end up creating a lot of headaches for yourself with selectors. And I don't think that's very good hygiene in the long run for the scalability of an application. For something that's like this, that's so single use and so um, it's so like singular focused. I'm going to perform some CRUD actions on some photos. And the photos, they all have different types, but the photo types are like filters. The topics that drive these photo types are like filters. I'm really just applying a filter. And I'm saying, okay, well, get me a specific thing based on this filter type. People is a filter type. Great. Let's load up all the people filter typed assets. So this is some of the thing that I've been excited about recently that I don't think is a very common pattern that's being used in the Ngrx community. If it is, it's not being broadcasted. I've probably seen one article from alligator.io mentioning anything about an indexed reusable store. So far, I've been able to use this twice within my specific client project that I've been working on. But one of the things I want to address too before we end this broadcast is how we can utilize entity adapters to get us the same CRUD dynamic and still keep all the functionality the same. This is going to be so easy. So going back to the code, we already have a win out of the gate. We want to use entity adapters in our reducer. This is going to be straightforward. So now I can extend this to use entity adapter, right? And give it the type of photo. I no longer need photos, which means that I'll need to trickle down through my store. Any references to photos I'll need to get rid of. But now I'm utilizing an entity adapter or an entity state. I need to then use an entity adapter. I'm going to define my adapter and of course give it my typings because I really love TypeScript typings. I'm going to create entity adapter. And then I'm going to take this guy and in here, where I would have done just the return of this reduce piece, I'm going to go ahead and take my state dot adapter dot. Why am I not getting the IntelliSense to pop up? Create initial state. You know what? I don't like to have to overthink things. Create entity adapter, get the initial state. I think I used the wrong type here. There we go. Take that state, bind it to the particular slice I want. So now I'm going to have multiples of this initial state loaded up with its entities and IDs and all that good stuff wrapped in. And I'm pretty much using the adapter now. It's ready and available for me. And when I need to perform my updates, I can do let's make this more readable. Do this adapter dot set all photos to this state. I should be able to do it by saying state. Now with this, we're missing, yeah, because it doesn't like what we're doing with that. And now we're using the adapter methods to modify our photos. and bind to the same state. Eric, we're actually, are you asking where does the selected photo type get updated? I think I might be understanding the question. The selected photo type would be updated here in this reducer, and only when I call the action to update it. So I'll always be stuck on one asset type unless I'm able to switch the active type to the next via this action. Hopefully I answered that question correctly. But yeah, so this is how we can update it in the reducer. The effect stays the same. We don't need to touch that because we're just modifying and calling actions here. And then in the selector, instead of doing a select of all photos from state.photos, I can expose my selector methods from the adapter. Select all from adapter dot get selectors. Okay, cool, great. Call this select all active photos, and this will be the active photo type. I like these kind of comments in here because they inform exactly what's going on in the application. There's no guesswork. Of course, we could just utilize that in the selector. Make sure that we pull that in. Escape. Make sure that we pull that in from the reducer. And now, did I include that in the right place? Select all is going to give us an array. And this is where we want the array. I feel like I did this in the wrong place. But if I do the photo state, photo state, any state photo returns us the photos array. State photos type. I'm definitely pulling this in one of the wrong selectors here, but with the select all from our adapter, we should be able to load in the right. For the sake of time here, I'm not going to spend too much time trying to fix this, but in our selector here, we're definitely able to reference our adapter methods in our selectors. I just probably have my nesting wrong, or how deep I'm drilling down into my state here. But that really brings me to the end of what I wanted to talk about from this particular part of the app. This topics index here is yelling at us because we're also exporting an adapter method from our adapter piece from here. So we don't want that in our code. But if anybody has any further questions about this, feel free to comment away. You can also find me on Twitter. But right now, I think that wraps up what I wanted to show you guys.
Thank you so much, Morgan. That was an amazing presentation. We really appreciate it. Again, we did drop Morgan's Twitter handle in the comments. So feel free to get a hold of him on Twitter if you have any further questions. If you're watching this later, feel free to reach out and follow. And that is the end of JavaScript Marathon for May. Again, we are back in July for a week. So look out on this.media on our Twitter and javascriptmarathon.com for details coming soon. Morgan, thank you so much for joining, and we will see y'all soon.
All right.
Bye.